Hi, thanks so much for coming out on a rainy day. At my last appointment with heads of mission for the various EU consuls, they're like, we don't know how many people will actually turn out. It's raining, which resonated with me. So I'll confess, first of all, apologies. Michelangelo would have been fabulous, and he has a better accent than I do. But as your professor said, we had last minute very senior visitors. Unlike the White House, the president of the European Commission is staffed very thinly. It's a pretty thin cabinet, unlike the hundreds of people that typically work in the West Wing. And the chief of staff and the head trade advisor made a last minute decision to come out and have meetings in Washington, and Michelangelo, for very solid career reasons, decided he needed to stay there. So you have me instead. And because it was last minute, because I'm fundamentally lazy, I actually started snooping around at old decks. And we decided not to do a deck and just talk, because I think actually a conversation would be a lot more interesting for you guys and for me. And it was fascinating to me because the deck I pulled was one actually prepared by Thomas Barrett, the president's trade advisor, just before the election in 2020. And it was 10 new things you need to know about trade. And I'm like, oh, that could be a really interesting way to frame this conversation. And it was actually kind of depressing because as I was going through the deck, I really didn't have to change very much. There's been a really strong continuity in trade policy from the Obama administration to the Trump administration to the Biden administration, though I will say the Biden administration was a lot nicer about it. So now we're back to Trump. By the way, I worked for the EU. I actually came to the EU in 2015. I was hired to join the negotiating team because we were negotiating the transatlantic trade and investment partnership with the US. We stopped negotiating that after the election when we realized it was very unlikely to be fruitful to come forward. In the run-up to the election, then candidate Trump was making all these like crazy statements like, I'm going to put tariffs on everything. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do that. And a number of my trade professional friends back in Brussels kept saying, well, he can't do that. And I kept saying, yeah, he can. Every Congress has given the executive insane powers to do all these things. And no one would believe me. So in August, when it was slowed down, I wrote a memo, a very long memo, outlining all the various statutory authorities by which the president could impose tariffs and take other trade actions without congressional approval. And being that it was August, very few people read it, or they said, oh, that's nice, this is never going to happen, and they put it in a drawer. Come November, my phone starts blowing up. People saying, hey, you have that memo? And as it turned out, it was the roadmap, right? I talked about 232, I talked about Section 301, I talked about IEPA, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, all of which have come into play, particularly as the executive has gone very maximalist in its powers vis-a-vis Congress and the courts. So I had played around with this slide deck, which we decided not to do, and my denouement was going to be, why should you care? Why does the EU-US transatlantic trade relationship matter to you sitting here in Los Angeles? And so I'm going to show this card early, then we can talk. So the EU and the US is by far the largest commercial relationship in the world. It dwarfs every other commercial relationship there is. Together, we're 800 million consumers. We have about 30% of global trade, 43% of global GDP. We are each other's largest trade and investment partners when you look at the EU as a single market. So services trade, I'm going to mix data here because services data always lags trade and goods data. Services trade in 2023 was about $447 billion. The US has a surplus there. EU goods trade in 2024, EU-US goods trade was about $978 billion, where the EU is fortunate to have a trade surplus. So all in, that's about $1.5 trillion annually, which is a big number and hard to think about. So let's break it down. That's $3.9 billion a day, $162 million hourly, $2.7 million per minute, and about $45,000 per second. So in the 2 minutes I've been talking to you, that's $5 million in trade? And trade and investment is not just about money flowing, it's about people. That trade and investment creates massive numbers of jobs on both sides of the Atlantic. Jobs that we depend on. It grows tax bases, it helps local communities, it funds things like firefighting here in Los Angeles. So the trade and investment relationship goes far beyond people or the question of, far beyond corporations and far beyond the question of is globalization a good or a bad thing, but it has real life daily impacts on everyone in this room. And so that's why I'm going to start with the premise. It's important. You should worry about it. And why? So I'm going to leave aside the geopolitical for a minute. We can come back to that if we want. And I should start by saying, and I should remember to say, in my capacity today, I'm speaking as Jen. I'm not speaking on behalf of the EU. You cannot attribute my remarks to my ambassador or my commissioner for trade. And if you do, I will come and find you. So where are we? Trump is absolutely keeping his campaign promises to blow everything up. Now, he campaigned 8 years ago on that same premise, but he wasn't as good at it, right? He didn't have a team around him. It was leak central. It was chaotic. It was fiat by tweet. It is much, much more organized now. Sitting in DC, a metric that I like to remind people of, I mentioned at the beginning that the executive is sort of maximalizing executive power. How is that expressed? Primarily through something called an executive order, right? The White House publishes it. Every president does it. They're good and they're bad. They're very easy to set a policy, but also very easy for the next president to undo. In his first term in 4 years, the president signed 220 executive orders. In the first 14 days, he signed 45. And my count was already off because that was on Tuesday. And there were several, he's basically having a daily signing ceremony and press conference. And so how has this expressed itself in trade? He's already done 3 executive orders on tariffs, imposing tariffs on 2 friends and a not friend. So his second day in office, no, it was Friday. So 4th day in office, I'm sorry, I'm already losing, the trauma is getting to me. He signed executive orders imposing 25% tariffs on Mexico for their failure to act on immigration and fentanyl trade, 25% tariffs on Canada for the same reason, but dropped that down to 10% for oil and gas, which the US depends on, and an additional 10% tariff on China on top of the very large tariffs put in place in his first administration that were both kept in place and increased during the Biden administration. And once again, it was fentanyl, not immigration, but just fentanyl. So what happened? So they pretty much, all those people got off cheap. So Canada, and I'm going to hold aside the question of, is fentanyl trade really an emergency sufficient to trigger the powers of the International Economic Emergency Powers Act? Does Canada actually have a significant role in fentanyl trade that is affecting the US? Holding aside all those questions, those 2 allies got off fairly cheap. Mexico agreed to step up a presence at the border, something they've been doing for about the last 8 years. I think maybe they added some helicopter flights. Canada basically made a public announcement of a deal that was struck with the United States last December regarding trying to control the border more and named a czar. So, and in doing so, they delayed tariffs by 30 days each. China did not make any offers. Instead, China responded in a way that we would expect them to, of imposing countermeasures that might bite pretty bad, not just tariffs, but also looking at export controls against various critical minerals, which are necessary for the United States, high-tech businesses to continue. So what do we expect as the EU? I would say it is very, very likely that there is an executive order, possibly in the next 48 hours, imposing tariffs against the European Union. I could not fathom what the emergency might be. I don't think it's going to be fentanyl or immigration. But he has other options. Looking back to the first term, he was very convinced that there was a national security threat posed by German cars, and tried to impose tariffs because Mercedes-Benz and BMWs were posing a national security threat to the United States. So what are we going to do in response? I think everyone in the EU is hoping for the Canada-Mexico solution, right? The fairly friendly, fairly low-cost, tweetable solution. And I think depending upon your political perspective in the United States, you've either been reading that Canada and Mexico got off cheap, or you've been reading that tariffs work and Canada and Mexico bent to as well, right? So there is an information quality right here. And so what is significant about this go around for the EU is that we are far, far better prepared. I will be the first person to admit that 8 years ago, we were kind of caught on the hind foot. No one was really expecting that there was going to be, massive tariffs. We were scrambling to find ways to respond to the various, national security threats that were found against us involving steel trade, car trade, other things. And we scrambled a little bit to find that positive agenda. And we vowed last summer, as soon as the nomination was secured, that was not going to happen again, and actually established a task force in what we call SecGen to bring sort of the combined wisdom of the commission to formulate a positive agenda to propose to the president when the inevitable happened. So what might that look like? I can't tell you, I don't know all the secrets, but I think there's some obvious things that have been floating around and are out there in the press. The first would be LNG. The EU absolutely needs liquid natural gas, especially since we've cut off the spigot from Russia. The US's product is good, it's cheap. We will take every last drop that the US government will sell to us, or the private actors will sell to us. In fact, there's existing long-term contracts, and we've built up the infrastructure to accept the tankers bringing it over. The president really is into oil and gas and increasing US oil and gas trade. If we want to dress this up as a purchase agreement, if we want to dress this up as, something that the U.S. can claim as a win, that's great. Let's do that. I think another area that's really ripe for potential cooperation is defense and defense purchases. After the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Europe really got serious about defense. And in this new commission, we have what's called a common defense policy, where we're both pulling money to buy product, and we're coming up, recognizing that maybe we can't rely on traditional partners to guarantee our security. And so we do have some defense industry, some defense tech, Airbus, Leonardo, others, and certainly US companies build in Europe as well, but not at all the volumes that we need if we're going to be no longer able to rely on, for example, NATO support, right? So is defense tech an area where, heck, yeah, we'll buy it. There's generally a really long waiting list to buy a US-built fighter jet. But if we make those purchase commitments, it's something that we need. It's something the US wants to sell. Does that count as a win? Perhaps. I think other things that could come back. So I'm going to tell a story. I mentioned the car tariffs. Back then, it was the president of the commission was a man called Jean-Claude Juncker, who I happen to know from when I worked at Luxembourg, because he was the prime minister of Luxembourg. And when the tariffs were being threatened against cars, Mr. Juncker came over to meet with the president, and we were told 20-minute meeting, no press conference, nothing's going to happen. And so we equipped Mr. Juncker with lots of shiny little cards and pictures and graphs that showed the importance of the relationship, showed the importance, how much EU investment there was in auto trade in the US, how, big car companies, big European car companies in the US actually exported more vehicles than they sold domestically. And we sent him in. I thought to myself, this is going to be a disaster. I know Juncker. I have an opinion of Trump. I cannot imagine any two politicians that would like each other less. I was so wrong. So we're all waiting back at the delegation. We're sitting in someone's office. We have CNN on. We're like, where are they? Why haven't they called? They were like an hour and a half late. We got to get to the next appointment. And suddenly CNN connects, starts showing the Rose Garden. And they're pulling out two podiums and they're putting up flags. And we're like, all right. Well, it turns out Mr. Juncker struck a deal. He did two things. At the time of that meeting, U.S. farmers were really hurting because their market, they had primarily sold soybeans to the Chinese market. And that market ended after President Trump imposed Section 301 tariffs against China. Brazil came in, started sending their soya to China, and they lost the market then. They've still lost it. They needed a place to send their product. We need soybeans. We used to buy it from Brazil. We will buy it from you, right? And so now President Trump has an agreement. His tariff threat, resulted in a purchase agreement and a place to help farmers who are really hurting. And so can we do something like that with agriculture again? Maybe. The only thing I can think of is lobster. Another deal we struck back because positive is always better than negative when it comes to trade. The EU had just closed a free trade agreement with Canada, and Canadian lobsters had a special tariff treatment. Well, a Maine lobster and a Canadian lobster is exactly the same thing. we don't have a real competing lobster. We have a spiny lobster. It's a different, animal according to chefs. So we let Maine lobstermen get the same tariff treatment as Canadian lobstermen. The Canadians were really mad at us. The Maine lobstermen from the districts that had supported the president were really happy. It was another win. It was a very low-cost way for us to find a positive agenda and a win-win agenda. And that is what we were focused on, laser. And if we can't do that, if we can't find the positive agenda, well, we have tariffs, right? No one likes that. It hurts everyone. Tariffs hurt people, in Europe just as much as they hurt bourbon producers in Kentucky. But those lists have been worked on. The hard part for Europe is we have to get it, 27 member states have to agree to it. And I think that it's very, very likely that the US will have a sort of divide and conquer approach to member states this go around. In fact, when we were asking, we were a little surprised that we were not one of the first targets for executive orders. Like, why go after Canada, right? And we were told, in all seriousness, that, we're going after our largest trading partners first. And they had decided that because they weren't looking at the EU as a single market, they were looking at the EU as Germany and Spain and Italy and Slovenia, and decided that those were lesser players to the US when it came to the economic relationship. So the one thing that we have out there, and I'm going to bring this up just because my phone was blowing up this morning. So, 4 years ago, one of my smaller member states had the absolute temerity of acknowledging Taiwan, which caused China to impose trade restrictions against this member state and prohibit the importation of product from them. And we, as the EU, decided we did not have enough in our toolbox to address such a situation where someone was trying to employ economic coercion against us. And so we came up with something called the anti-coercion instrument. And at the time, everyone was like, this is an anti-China instrument. And some of us were going, or other large markets. And so now we have this tool that allows us to, gives the commission the legal authority to not just impose tariffs, but to take other appropriate action if someone is trying to inappropriately influence policy within the European Union. So maybe that's going after patent rights. Maybe that's prohibiting people from certain transactions. We are now better equipped to deal with threats from, from a bully than we were 4 years ago, than we were 8 years ago. And I bring this up because there was an anonymous European official apparently gave an interview yesterday where they if he comes after us with tariffs, we're gonna bring out our bazooka. And all these people are texting me like, what is the bazooka? I'm like, I have no idea. And so I finally pieced it together that this unnamed official was talking about the anti-coercion instrument and how that could be used as a policy response if we get backed into a corner. So what else do I think is going to happen in the short term? I think there's going to be a resumption of hostilities on a number of fronts. So towards the end of the Trump administration, we were in sort of three big disputes with the U.S. The U.S. had declared steel from wherever imported posed a national security threat to the United States under something called Section 232 of the Trade Act, and had imposed steel tariffs. And I'm going to say, full disclosure, when I was in private practice, I represented the U.S. steel industry. And so my husband mocks me to this day, like, oh, sure, when you were looking for steel tariffs, it was all good and for the right reasons, but now it's evil. But yes, you shouldn't, steel from, Germany doesn't really impose, that's going into a refrigerator, does not impose a national security threat to the defense of the United States. There have been steel tariffs in place since the Trump administration. Biden kept it in place, which is why when I was going through this old deck, I'm like, well, I don't have to change that slide. It was just in a nicer touch. It was a little more velvet. One thing the Bidens did for us is they suspended steel tariffs for imports from the EU in exchange for launching a discussion called GASA, the Global Arrangement on Sustainable Steel. And this was supposed to address overcapacity in non-market economies. It was supposed to address something that we call the CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. Never got off the ground because we were not willing to grant a full stop exemption for US steel from the CBAM before the CBAM had actually even gone into place. So I fully anticipate still 232s are coming back. Another thing that is absolutely coming back is something called digital services taxes. So way back in the day, a number of my member states started thinking about the fact that big US tech companies were coming to the EU, offering services, making a profit, and paying very little tax from the people and transactions that they were enjoying in the EU. And so a number of member states imposed something called a digital service tax and started collecting taxes from these big tax players. That was not very popular here. The US gets very upset when anyone goes after the tech sector. And so something called a Section 301 investigation was launched. Section 301 is a provision of the code. It's a process, so I'm okay with it. I'm a lawyer, I like process. That says if another country is acting against an existing trade agreement or treating us unfairly or discriminating against us, we can do whatever we want to you in the amount of trade that's been offset. So there were retaliation lists drawn up. Nice French wine was being tariffed. And the EU came up with a bunch of countervailing tariffs to offset the tariffs. And so we were launching a trade war. Biden's came in, put that on ice. They said, we're suspending these investigations, and instead launched something called the OECD talks on, Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 to address this question of how do you tax someone who has no physical presence in your jurisdiction? And I will be honest, Secretary Yellen got far ahead of her skis. She signed an agreement that could never possibly be passed by the US Congress. Other trading partners started implementing this, including the EU, Australia, Japan, Korea, and we implemented what's called Pillar 2 of the OECD agreement. And this is going to be a future. This is going to lead to not only are those DST fights coming back, but now there's going to be an OECD fight, I predict. The Republicans have indicated that they are opposed to everything that was agreed in the OECD. They want to blow it up. And they have their sight in particular in something called UTPR, the undertaxed profits rule. This is a rule which says that if you are if you have a company in your jurisdiction that is not paying sufficient tax at your home jurisdiction or in their home jurisdiction, there are profits that are going into their pockets that should be being taxed by the governments, you can impose the UTPR to grab some of that money. This drives the Republicans in Congress out of their minds. Representative Smith, who chairs the Ways and Means Committee, actually has introduced legislation saying that would impose a 5% surtax on any national or company whose home country imposes the UTPR. So that is a fight that is brewing. And we're going to circle back to taxes in 1 minute because I have one old baddie left. That's large civil aircraft. This is a fight which, honestly, looking at some of you guys, probably started before you were in kindergarten. It is a fight between Boeing and Airbus over how we subsidize large civil aircraft. It's kind of stupid because the real fight is not between, in my opinion, should not be between Boeing and Airbus. It should be Boeing and Airbus versus what's coming out of China, right? China has aspirations to develop an aeronautical industry that will rival the US and Europe. That was put on ice during the Biden administration. We have until 2026 to negotiate a settlement. This is following WTO cases that literally went on for 25 years. I mentioned UTPR. There is, I'm not sure where this is coming from, but I've seen the president has tweeted about VAT, the value added tax. That's how the EU taxes citizens as opposed to an income tax. The US has never liked it because VAT is refundable upon export. And there's been WTO fights about this. It's been ruled WTO consistent. And I think that the US might come back after this. There's a provision in the tax code which escapes me. I think it's Section 801. It's been there for like 60, 70 years. No one has ever touched it. But it's kind of like Section 301 on the trade. It's an analog to it which says, if any country treats us unfairly or discriminatorily in tax, we can double their US taxes. So that's floating around out there as something that could come up and become a live issue. And finally, I'll just reference TCJA. So the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act was President Trump's signature piece of legislation in his first term. Those are the provisions that are expiring now, and that's the big next legislative push, funding the government, settling the debt question, and renewing the TCJA tax cuts. I'm just going to put out there, one part of the TCJA was an export subsidy. It basically let US companies, US exporters deduct certain things off their taxes. Now, export subsidies are just de jure illegal under the WTO, under FTA agreement that exists. And that's something that at the time we looked at and said, do we pick a fight over this export subsidy in the TCJA? We did a lot of preparatory work. Ultimately, we didn't for a couple reasons. We were finding some peace clauses on steel and DSTs and other things. And to top it off, some European companies were like, the lower tax rate's pretty good. Maybe that's more important to us than competing against unfair export subsidies. So we didn't move forward on that, but who knows, it's possible. That could come up as a way to respond to any mischievousness on tax policy in the US. I wanted to touch on the intersection of tech and trade, because that's where you see those two policies, technology and trade policy, really intersect more than a lot of other policies do. And you see that in a lot of different ways. The US has been very active both very active in hating EU tech policy, particularly antitrust policy, but very active in terms of regulating technology in the US in a way that impacts trade. And so there's a few examples. The Justice Department passed a rule in December that we refer to as the bulk data rule, which says, protects Americans' privacy, protects their data from being sold by data brokers to bad actors in China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, all the places you admit. It also has a provision that prevents those data brokers, if they were to sell data to one of my guys in Europe, from how they could use it going forward. Now, we don't oppose this. We understand why. It really has to do with AI language model training, right? That you're trying to prevent bad people from accessing a lot of data that could be useful to them going forward. But that's out there. It is the new data issue. 4 years ago, it was, working on data privacy and coming up with a safe harbor for the US so companies could keep doing business. This is sort of the next iteration of that. The Commerce Department is doing tons of interesting stuff right now on national security and the ICTS supply chain. The rule that really pops to mind is they just did a rule on connected vehicles, which, the fear, and they've had European governments in with like spooky people telling us what their fear is. And the spooky people tell us that they fear that there really is not just data exfiltration, like with bulk data, but a real concern that remotely operated vehicles could be taken over, much like in that Netflix movie with Julia, what's her name, and driven to disrupt response in the US. And so the fear is if China invades Taiwan and China has a backdoor into Teslas and Waymos and other type of remotely controlled vehicles, they could direct those vehicles in a way that interferes with the US government's response to a military crisis. Is that far-fetched? I thought it was until I sat in a room at the State Department with some folks, and they laid out some of their reasoning as to why. And I thought, okay, there's some there. So the rule that they came up with is to prevent the importation or sale of products, software, and completed vehicles that have a tie to China or Russia. If they have an automatic driving system, so this is parking assistance, this is connectivity, like your phone, connects through Apple Play, or any sort of remote control ability of the car. And the U.S. is putting enormous pressure on allies around the world to adopt similar rules. Will we? Maybe. We're doing a risk assessment of that now. I think a question that Europe has is the only solution a ban on importation? Is there a way to do something with, for example, cyber standards? There's huge international work done on cyber standards. Are there other ways to protect the core of what you're trying to protect? But that's going to be an ongoing discussion, I think. AI in general, huge issue. U.S. doesn't like our AI rule. We're very proud of it, which imposes, ethical restrictions on the use of AI. President Trump took away Biden's AI order, which had a lot of cooperation between allies on AI, and is going to come out with one of his own. Export controls, particularly related to AI, are huge. The Biden administration published something called the AI diffusion rule, which is trying to attempt to control who can access the most advanced semiconductors. My problem in the EU as the single market is that this order divided the world into tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 countries. Tier 3 gets nothing. Tier 1 has no restrictions. Tier 2 has some restrictions. Unfortunately, not all my member states were deemed tier 1. It's crazy, right? We are security allies, we share technology goals. And how am I supposed to run a single market if a product can't go between member states, borderless trade? So we're thinking, as I said at the beginning, we're thinking about a positive agenda and other ways that we can cooperate. One of that, I mentioned defense tech. China is certainly going to be an area. I think the EU, in my time, 9-10 years working for the EU, our view of China has shifted. We still use the phrase a rival, a competitor, or partner, right? We recognize that China can be a lot of different things depending on the context, and we need China to be a world player, a world partner. But we also perhaps don't swing as hard as the U.S. would like, where the U.S., and this is a bipartisan view, this is not Republican, this is not Trump, this is bipartisan, see China as a much more existential threat. I think it's very, very upset with us for not hewing that same line. Critical minerals, I think, would be really interesting. The critical minerals it's just basically dirt and rocks, and everyone has it, but no one wants to dig it up or mine it or process it because it's dirty and disruptive and expensive. China has been extraordinarily good and farsighted about going around the world and buying up stocks of critical minerals and investments. So they have access to it, and they control upwards of 95% of the supply chain for most critical minerals that are needed to make semiconductors and cars and all sorts of tech that we like. And they're starting to be very vocal about restricting the export of those critical minerals to countries that aren't doing things that they like, including the United States. So we recognize that we jointly need access to critical minerals to continue our national defenses, our technology progress, that this is an absolutely critical goal. And let's find ways to do it. We were working with the Biden administration in trying to bring third countries into an EU-US critical mineral supply chain. The EU is also very interested in helping those people not just dig up the rocks, but also move up the value chain to process it so that there was something for everyone. How else can we do it? Okay, so President Trump has made a lot of noise about Greenland. Maybe it's about critical minerals. Maybe it's about expanding the territory of the US. I sometimes get the feeling that the president thinks that the best presidents, bought Alaska and the Northwest Territories and, the Louisiana Purchase, and that he wants that in the history books for himself. And maybe that's the real interest in Greenland and Panama and Gaza. But that's just my opinion. But there might be some scope there. So I was fascinated the other day. Ukraine's president said, yes, we'd be happy to make an agreement with the US on critical minerals, which the Ukraine has, if you continue support of our war effort. That's really interesting, right? And maybe that's a way where we can cooperate. Greenland has critical minerals. It's really hard to get to them, though, because there's very little infrastructure in Greenland. There's literally no roads, there's not enough labor, and because it's a native population, there's a very significant interest in preserving the environment and protecting the environment. And so that is another challenge, but perhaps it's an area where we can cooperate going forward. So as I said, we are relentlessly focused on a positive agenda, but we're ready if we can't find one. So I'm going to circle back to one question, which was, that's my slide that we didn't do. Does America first mean EU last? I actually think in some ways America first has strengthened the European Union. So America first has definitely hurt the European Union in terms of the interest in getting companies to reshore, and this continued under Biden with the Infrastructure Act, trying to get European investment to move investment from Europe to the United States, right? But the bottom line is no developed country, certainly no high labor cost country, can make every last widget that you need. You have to trade, you have to import in order to export. And our refrain for 8 years now and another 4 is going to be, it's about friendshoring. It's about making sure that the people in your supply chain have good labor practices and good environmental practices and aren't using exploitive labor. And together, if we do that, we can back each other up. Like, I think about COVID and, those early days of COVID when, you were like making a mask out of a t-shirt because you couldn't find, there was no PPE, rubber PPE was going to the hospitals. And that actually prompted this big movement of, well, we need a US-based PPE industry. And several company startups launched and started making PPE so they could, get the Buy America contracts. Of course, all the stuff that you make, masks and gowns out of, the material itself comes out of China. And so they were, finding and competing. And I have to say, I've heard of 3 of those US PPE companies have now gone out of business, right? They thought that there was going to be this huge need. Turns out there was a very limited and specific need. You can't manufacture for every single one of those limited and specific needs. It's just not sensible. It's just not possible. And frankly, the US doesn't have the labor force either to do it, right? So we have to find ways to cooperate on supply chain, and hopefully someone will find the magic bullet. One way that America First made EU stronger is it caused, much like Brexit did, caused a lot of inward reflection. Right? What does the EU need? Can we rely on the United States and NATO for security? My current ambassador, Yvonne Lipsiane, she's fascinating. She's really young. She's the first Eastern, state to be ambassador, and she's right on the border. And her welcome speech to us was talking about packing up her household goods. Her charge letter was, come and secure funding for Ukraine. And, she was talking about when she was packing up her household goods for her and her 12-year-old, looking at her canned goods and water and battery-powered radio and convincing herself it was okay to leave that behind. Like, war hits different when it's literally just across the border. And so it did. It made us, come up with, in this new commission, a common defense policy. It made us decide that we were going to pool funds to buy defensive, to buy munitions and to increase the size of standing armies. So in that sense, I think America First made the EU stronger. What worries me, and once again, personal level, is I think that America First has somewhat created this unholy alliance of China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. Right? You see it in Ukraine, where all 4 of those countries are supporting the war effort, backing Russia up. It's created opportunities for China to increase its relevance on the world stage. When the U.S. pulled out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, it created an opportunity for China to develop its own trade agreements. When the U.S. pulling back, it's created, imposing sanctions on various currencies around the world. It's created an opportunity for China to move up, the pole in terms of the importance of its currency as a trading currency, as a savings currency. So I worry sometimes that being so inwardly focused on America First has actually made America weaker. And I'm saying this as a U.S. citizen. I know it's very confusing. Every time I say we, my family looks at me and goes, which we do you mean this time? That it has created opportunities for players on the world stage that don't have Westerners' best interest at heart. And it has made them stronger in some ways when it was attempting to make them weaker. So I'm going to stop there and let's just chat. What do you want to chat about?
Okay, so let me get it started here. President Trump has, on a number of occasions, said that, with respect to Greenland, that he was going to put fairly significant tariffs on Denmark. Mm-hmm. But of course, Denmark's part of the EU. How, from the EU perspective, is that viewed? If that happens and it's on Danish goods, but not the rest of the EU, how does that work, and how are you all thinking about it?
I think we circle the wagons. So the way the EU is set up, the Commission has sole competency over trade policy. So for Denmark to respond, it really needs to be a Commission response. And we are a single market, it will be a whole market response. Just a story. So Denmark's been on their mind for a while. A friend of mine told me that the Danish embassy, last September, got this urgent call saying, we need your help. We need sealskins and a Greenland dog sled team at Mar-a-Lago. Stat, can you help me? Well, it's illegal to import sealskins into this country. And the dog sled teams from Greenland are not like cute little huskies. They're vicious mean dogs. So it did not happen, but this has been something that's brewing for a long time. We have had discussions at very high level in Brussels about an appropriate response if there is a targeted response against Denmark. I think all the member states understand that it's always going to be a targeted response. Germany and France were the targets of the CAR 232. And everyone bore the pain, right, of responding to that situation. There's always going to be, there is definitely a divide and conquer strategy from the U.S. and we'll have a unified response. And that can get very hard and very tough and very hard decisions are made. I had an ambassador who used to joke like, oh, don't complain to me about, 400 congressmen. I've got 27 prime ministers that I have to corral. But eventually we get there, right? Eventually we get there and we find a way to respond appropriately and minimize pain, but someone's always going to take the hit.
Thank you again so much for your insights. It was fantastic listening to you. And I had a question regarding how the negotiations occur when you're in front of each other and just the standard way, what that looks like.
If we go back to TTIP, it was hundreds of bureaucrats coming together in an out-of-the-way place, sitting in dark conference rooms, saying, and here's my text. Mm-hmm. And they was saying, and here's my text. And then, getting through the formalities and talking. This has been a lot more personality-based in my experience lately. It's been a lot more, and I think in the first Trump administration, it in part was because of, for lack of a better term, the lack of professionalization, right? They didn't have people confirmed for, a year. They weren't staffed up. It was somewhat chaotic. And so there was a lot of that personal one-to-one connection, whether it was Mr. Juncker and Trump, whether it was my chief of staff, Bjorn, who found a relationship with his counterpart in the Biden White House. And a lot of stuff is getting done that way at a very micro individual level. That being said, the full apparatus of state is still there. Like the State Department is still, monitoring things and trying to smooth stuff over and stepping in where it's helpful. I don't know where the balance of power is going to fall out in this new administration, right? That it once again is so personality driven and maybe wealth driven that, I don't know who the real power players are going to be. I have some concerns though, I had last Friday night, a friend of mine at the Commerce Department texted me and said, we just received an order halting all government to government contact, no foreign government contacts to be allowed. The Commerce Department does everything, right? They're the Foreign Commercial Service. They're promoting U.S. interests around the world. And I thought, okay, this is really strange. This is really anomalous. I've never heard of that before. It seems to only be that agency. We had actually had a meeting set up for next week with the new head of the Europe office. It's just a courtesy. Come have coffee, meet the team. We'll meet your team. And we're like, well, maybe my contact was wrong. Maybe she was misinterpreting. But now that meeting got canceled. That's weird. That is anomalous. And I think it's because people in the last administration felt burnt by leaks. They felt burnt by the deep state, working to undermine them. And these are efforts to prevent that from happening again. The problem is they just don't have enough bodies. Like the few people that I know who have gone into the White House, one has texted me with a little bit. The other won't respond to an email. And so I think they're overwhelmed. I think that's the right word. White House staffing is frankly always a little crazy. There, several hundred people worked in the National Security Council under Biden. I've heard that they're trying to cut that down to 25%. So less than 100 people, running the White House and controlling all policy. We'll see how that goes. But I think it's going to slow stuff down.
Hi, thank you for giving your valuable insight and spending your time. My kind of two questions, they're kind of tacked to each other. Now, the rationale for the tariff is that if you increase the tariff and start making locally and you buy locally, it will benefit us. First thing is when a tariff is given, it is the consumer that is going to pay for it. Mm-hmm. Best Buy, for example, wants to import a TV and a 25% tariff comes on Samsung or Sony. It is ultimately Best Buy he's going to charge back to the customer. So I cannot understand that rationale of, because it's a 25% jump of the products that you buy. Secondly, even if the tariff is given and you start manufacturing locally, There is a startup phase time that is involved. Things are not going to come overnight. And then there are going to be many things that are going to be barriers. For example, the environmental studies, this study, that study. How is it going to be practical for us to manufacture goods in America by the time, his tenure is going to be over? So can you please address those two questions?
Well, in terms of tariff as a tax, absolutely 100% I agree with you. In fact, every year I go to something called the National Conference of State Legislatures, which is all 50 states come together, and what a great opportunity to do a lot of outreach. So I take a booth on the floor. I have the European Coffee House. I bring in a barista. I give away free nice coffee. You have to stand in line and wait for your coffee and talk to me, right? So I have one of these state cards for every state, and I have an opportunity to talk to people at state and local level. And one year when tariffs first came up, we actually had a cartoon made that explained, how a tariff is a tax on the consumer. And I think maybe it's time to bring out that cartoon again, because it's not something that's well understood. And once again, it comes back to what information sources are you consuming, right? Things are so bifurcated in this country. If you read certain sources, you understand the tariffs. If you read in other sources, you take the president at his word when he says, I'm putting a tax on it and they're going to pay it. That is not correct. In terms of the startup, once again, I agree with you. It takes a very long time to move investments forward. It takes a long time to bring manufacturing online, and you're going to miss a lot of critical opportunities while you do so. I think that's part of the president's regulatory agenda now, right? They're going to doge away all of the regulations to make it easier to move fast and break things. But at the end of the day, it still takes time to build a semiconductor foundry. It takes a long time to build a chemical plant. The United States will not be able to go it alone and do it overnight, full stop.
Good morning. Thanks for coming on. One question, I think it's safe to say that the current administration puts a bit of a strain on relationships with Europe. And Ursula
You're very
von der Leyen,
diplomatic.
Yeah. And Ursula von der Leyen is very much a proponent of global trade. However, I'd love to hear your opinion and perhaps concern about the European Union, as Germany is about to elect probably somewhat right-leaning, if not very right-leaning government, and so do other European countries. Do you see that sort of the turmoil within Europe might get in the way of those efforts that Ursula von der Leyen and the European Commission have at the moment, and how you see those develop over the next couple of years?
Holding aside the question of elections, since they haven't happened yet, I think actually something that I found kind of fascinating. Mrs. van der Leyen can bring it when she needs to. So Europe has always been right out there in terms of negotiating trade agreements, right? That's actually, I think, a huge difference between the U.S. and the EU, where Trump went from like mega deals to mini deals, and Biden went to no deals. And in that same time period, we completed an agreement with Mercosur. We just Trump's talking about leaving NAFTA. We just revitalized and renewed our trade agreement with Mexico and Colombia. We have a trade agreement with Canada. I think the UK is more likely to complete a trade agreement with the EU or Canada than the US at the moment, right? So I think not only are we continuing on that negotiating path, but we've been a little vicious about taking advantage of larger member states' momentary political weakness to get some stuff through, like Mercosur, right? And so I'm not going to say any more. You can just nod knowingly.
Thanks for being here.
Sure.
I'm from Spain, and one of the main reasons I'm studying here is because I think Europe is going to keep on declining in the world scene. What does the US have to gain by partnering with Europe in the long term? What is Europe going to offer the US that the US can't get elsewhere?
Shared values, right? You don't just export goods, you export values. And traditionally anyway, right, Western democracies had a lot of common shared values, sort of liberal ideas about the world. I think there's some in the US that are moving away from those. Globalization is not just anti-elite, it's anti-liberal, and so that is shaping the perspective on the American right about a lot of it. It's funny that you say you think Europe is in decline. My husband's currently pursuing renewing his Italian citizenship. it's a different perspective of, I think a lot of Americans would express concern about the direction of travel in the United States. But the bottom line is through history, from the founding of this country, Europe has been its greatest friend, right? France in the Revolution, U.S. coming to our aid in World War II, the Marshall Plan. Like, we have been there for each other for hundreds of years. And I don't see that anything fundamental has changed in the relationship to make me think that it's no longer valuable, right? The question for me, I think the big question is how reliable partners are we for each other? That's really, I think, in the end of the day, that's the question that has to be answered on both sides. But from a very mercantilist point of view, the US absolutely needs the EU commercially, right? We have 500 million consumers. We're the biggest destination for US foreign direct investment. Holding aside the silly question of does trade deficits matter, you have the absolutely massive amount of affiliate income and affiliate trade from US MNCs in Europe. You just can't walk away from that.
So whenever I read about the tariffs, in the news, they all say that the other countries will put counter tariffs on us and as a form of retaliation. But that never made much sense to me, because if a tariff is a tax on your own people, as he so eloquently pointed out a few minutes ago, that the counter tariffs just do the same damage on the other side. So like, why does everyone reach for counter tariffs instead of, other things that I would argue would cause more pain? Like, if Europe said we're no longer going to enforce American copyrights, or we'll just let, everyone download whatever American movie they wanted and not pay, like, I feel that'd be a lot more, threatening and a lot less painful for Europe than a counter tariff. So why does everyone reach for a counter tariff instead of something like that?
Well, 8 years ago, we didn't have alternatives to tariffs, right? We didn't have the anti-coercion instrument. Now we do. Our toolbox has grown. And so maybe you will see that. But you're right, that's why it is so difficult. That's going back to the Denmark question, right? Of how do you negotiate amongst 27 member states with their own economic interests, how to inflict damage on the US economy without damaging your own. And so there are teams of economists that have been working on that, like going through the trade data. And so you'll often find stuff that is a luxury that is not a net everyday item gets on the list. So it's bourbon, it's California wines. You always try to be very strategic, and you pick goods from states that are in power, right? So you pick, bourbon was always on the list because of Mitch McConnell, but also because Europeans like drinking bourbon, and if they have to pay 25% more instead of drinking French cognac, oh well, right? Win-win. So now the question is going to be, with the change in leadership, who gets hit? So it's, Mike Johnson's from Wisconsin, Senator Thune's from South Dakota, one of the Dakotas. So that suggests maybe it's going to be dairy and agri products. Is it going to be cattle and soya? Like, you find pain points that you can live with short term to inflict enough damage here in the US to change policy. And last go around with all the steel tariffs, it hurt everyone hit US agriculture, right? Because they were the big red states that supported Trump. And farmers were losing so much money that virtually all of the tariff revenue from those tariffs went to subsidize US agriculture because farms were going out of business. And so that's the rationale. I agree with you. It's hard. It is a cell phone. You are shooting yourself in the foot. But until very recently, we had a very limited tool set. Now we have some others. For being with us. Thank you. I appreciate it. It was good.